the state of the industry, how market forces are shaping your business and policies. Here to help us navigate this is Julie Bensel, Human Resources Manager at Sokolblosser Winery in Oregon. She has more than 25 years of experience in talent engagement strategy, total rewards, performance management, and employee coaching, training, and retention, not just in wine, but in the hotel, hospitality, and health insurance industries as well. Julie, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks everyone for listening to our presentation today. I wanted to start by setting the context for today's session. The advisory board felt that this session was important as the content would give us real-time information that could impact us industry-wide. As you know, it's imperative to stay alert to what's happening in the economy in terms of how it will affect hiring, budgeting, and general business practices. Additionally, it would be helpful for us to know how it may affect sales going forward. Today, we have two panelists who will share vital information to understand what might lie ahead and how this information can help us manage our expectations going forward into the next several months. I'd like to introduce you to Leanne Pierce. Leanne is a manager of Wells Fargo's bank's food, beverage, and agribusiness industry advisors. In her role as manager, Leanne leads a team of industry experts who provide risk management, thought leadership, and industry analytics to Wells Fargo bank customers and lending teams throughout North America. Leanne also acts as a manager for the wine and vineyard sector, having spent more than 15 years leading a wine specialty group for an agribusiness bank. Leanne is a graduate of Cal Poly with a degree in ag management. She lives in Templeton, California on a small vineyard with her family and her two dogs. We will also be hearing from John Maramarco. John is a managing partner at BW166, providing advisory services and data intelligence to the beverage alcohol industry. John is also a partner and editor of the Gromberg-Fredrickson Report. He holds a Bachelor of Science from UC Davis in Agricultural Science and Management. His early career was with Allied Domecq, where he held various management positions, culminating in a divisional CEO role for 7 years. Following that, John worked for Constellation Brands as the CEO of multiple divisions, both domestically and internationally. As the CEO at Winebow, a national importer of fine wines and distributor of fine wines and craft spirits. Leanne, why don't you kick us off?
Great. Thanks, Julie. It's wonderful to be here today to talk with all of you. If you want to go ahead and advance the next slide. When we had our planning session, they said, hey, John and Leanne, look at your crystal ball. And so when we were done, I took a walk and I thought, you know, what can I say today? And I realized as I was walking around that this crystal ball is very, you might have a vision, but things start to rain down on it and your vision gets obscured this year by so many factors. So as we look into 2021, I really wanted to talk about some things that we see maybe staying more the same than you really think about. So moving on to the next slide, please. So some things that don't really change a lot really are supply and demand trends. They're really tough to change. People know what they want and they know what they like. So when we think, first of all, about demographics, we all know the population growth is slowing. It's been happening for a time and you've been dealing with that already in your businesses. I'm not going to say there's going to be no COVID boom from being sheltered in place, but overall, we see that trend continuing. Also, supply and demand trends, you know, really people have found new ways to get product through. Wine sales have been continued on the retail side. Some changes that may happen there, we may see more technology coming forward to really increase productivity. We may see continued consumer disruption, but you're learning how to deal with that. And of course, trade, you always have dollars in disputes in every economic cycle. So you've learned, I think, over time how to deal with that as well. We see food trends remaining unchanged even as people have started to get their groceries in a different way. They still want things that are easy. They're having long days on Zoom calls like these, and they want to be able to, you know, get something on the table relatively quickly. They're concerned about the health aspects of that food. And because they may be bored and tired of Netflix, they like a little variety so that they can cook something different from their family once in a while. And we really see a push towards the social consciousness of the products that we're producing. So, you know, if you're sustainable or you're fish friendly, I think you really want to think about the conversation you're having with your consumers around that, because we see that as a trend that's here to stay for a while. So next slide, please. So, you know, this was funny. I tapped my economist friend's shoulder and said, hey, can you look at what beer and wine have looked like through the pandemic? And beer, we really saw some changes, but when he ran the CPI on wine pricing, we noticed that wine away from home and wine at home, really the trajectory has not changed all that much. You know, as this lingers on, it may, but right now it's holding up, and I'm sure John has some more data on that. Next slide, please. And where we're buying things has changed. So this chart's a little confusing, but if you focus on that black line, that is non-store retailers. So these are people like your Amazons. You know, we just saw GoPuff buy Bevmo. You know, that's a delivery service buying a retailer. So, you know, we're really seeing that trend on the online, you know, continuing on. Next slide, please. And speaking to online, this is some of the demographics of what's happened during the pandemic. You can see in August a year ago, online sales were at 1.2 billion, and by August of 2020, they were up to 5.7 billion. And the average order value had increased, and the number of customers had increased. So, you know, we really see online continuing even after the pandemic becomes more normalized. I think this will continue on because people have gotten used to the convenience factor, and the services have gotten so much better. Next slide, please. And speaking to that, you can see the online grocery pickup and delivery adoption. You know, still at 81% in June of 20, people were using these services over and over again. So it's becoming more ingrained the longer that we're sheltered in place, and I think that will continue. Next slide. So the key developments we see in 2021, we think there'll be accelerated business consolidation. We've got, you know, a lot of pain out there, particularly on Main Street. And I, you know, just referenced the GoPuff and the Bevmo consolidation. You're going to start to see more of that going on as this lingers on. We think ag tech innovation and tech in general will continue to be a big player as businesses look for efficiencies and ways to get by maybe with a little bit less labor force. They're going to turn to equipment for that. We think government support will be challenged going forward. You know, we had a pretty nice stimulus package, but I think as cities and counties continue to struggle with their tax base, it'll be harder to see that stimulus perhaps get passed so easily the next time. We also think that restaurants are going to skew towards value basis as a, you know, a way to maybe appeal to a wider base of consumers who are struggling out there a little bit. And a way to keep themselves alive going forward. This sector, as you all know, has really been hit hard in this pandemic, and they are seeking ways to attract clients back into their restaurants as things open up. And we think online and club store sales will continue to increase. Online we talked about, but the club stores have been a really big news item here as well. People who are watching their dollars are definitely turning to those venues to get their consumer goods in. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put this in to kind of show you what job openings has done over the last several years. You can see the real big dip as we got sheltered in place, but you're starting to see a recovery in job openings as businesses are starting to become more vibrant and reopen. This may change as we're having a little COVID spike now, but I thought it was interesting to see that that it's really recovered here recently. Next slide, please. And so what skill set do we think will be needed to fill those jobs? Obviously, you know, since we think ag tech is a big deal, we think you're going to need people who can operate advanced machinery. And whether you have the training programs to do that or you're getting that service from your vendors, we see the need to look for those people in the future. Obviously, the online experience, I think that's been a theme today, right? You've heard more and more about this, e-commerce and digital marketing. As you continue to interact with your consumers and people are still looking for that experience level, having a good, robust online platform will become more and more necessary. We also think experience in the sale of consumer packaged goods will be in demand because as you have more interaction with retailers or you're putting together new products to try and attract people, you're going to need people who know how to talk that language and to be out on the street, maybe doing some category management or learning how to promote things within the grocery stores. We think food safety will continue to be, high on everyone's mind through the pandemic. And as this lingers on, I really see a need for more HR and legal help. Your employees are dealing with a lot. I think you've had some great speakers on that today. And issues are just going to arise. And the longer we stay locked down, probably the more will come up. Next slide, please. So that's it for me. I just gave you a really general overview of what we see coming down the pike. I think John will now take over and go a little deeper. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Julie. I want to talk a little bit about the pandemic. I want to talk a little bit about the economy and talk about wine. Next slide, please. I do want to go into some history, so I don't want to put people to sleep, but wine interacts with the whole beverage alcohol industry, and I want to talk about that. I want to look at wine share of beverage alcohol over time, how the pandemic is impacting wine. I want to touch a little further on Leanne's comment about population and forecast and what the implications that'll have, and then roll all this together in terms of what are the human resource implications as we come out of this. Next slide, please. Very busy chart. This basically looks at consumer spending on beverage alcohol for the last 60 years. And don't want to get into it a lot. The key takeaway here is that really consumers have continually increased their spending on consumer alcohol over time. And this tracks beer off-premise, spirits off-premise, wine off-premise, and total beverage alcohol on-premise. On the right-hand side, it looks a bit at the different recessions and the peak to trough of the recession. And just to give you a little context, the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009, where we didn't really see a big drop in beverage alcohol spending, the change was 4.3%. The second quarter of this year, the drop was 31.4%. This is actually the worst drop in economic activity, although it's rebounding quickly. Next slide, please. Just to put consumer spending on beverage alcohol where it's been kind of consistently growing over time, the black line is new vehicle sales. And so we have challenges in the beverage alcohol industry, wine industry, when we have recessions and things, but just imagine if you were in the auto industry and the ways you have to adjust that kind of business. Next slide, please. Looking at trends over time, trends in the beverage alcohol industry don't change that fast. Beer has actually been flat for about 20 years, but it's gone through a big evolution from traditional big brands to the craft breweries and now into hard seltzers. Spirits were in decline for about 15 years from 1980 to 1995, but they're currently the fastest growing category of beverage alcohol, and they're the ones that are actually winning right now through the pandemic. Wine actually, most people don't remember this, unfortunately I do, but the industry was in decline from 87 to 93. From 93 to 2017, we actually saw a growth rate of 3.2% per year, but we've actually seen the wine industry slowing the last few years, and I think that's going to continue. We do some looks at the beverage alcohol business and look at equivalent servings, and so we look at 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, and 1.5 ounces of spirits. Over the since 93, the industry overall has grown 1.2% per year in number of servings, and wine has outgrown that almost 3 times for 25 years, but we've kind of been reverting back to that 1.2% a year. And so all of us that are used to a fast growing wine business, we may be working in an industry going forward that's growing more slowly, but it's not going to be declining in my mind. Next slide, please. A couple of things. I said that beverage alcohol servings have been growing 2% a year. And we use a lot of indexes just to be able to tie things together. And we try and avoid talking about how many billions of servings Americans drink every year. But just looking at our serving index and our population index, servings have grown to 1.2% a year since 1993. Legal drinking age population has grown almost the same rate of 1.2% a year. And so basically the growth of beverage alcohol has been driven by just growth in legal drinking age adults. When you go back in history and you look at the growth in the 60s and 70s, that was driven by a lowering of legal drinking age during the Vietnam War and post-Vietnam War, and then go back to the 60s and 3 martini lunches, etc. But all of that was reversed in the 80s due to social challenges, MAD, SAD, etc. And I don't think we'll get back to those levels. And I think servings per LDA are likely to remain flat. And so as we look at the business, we have to think about what's going to happen to the legal drinking age population, the LDA population, and how will we deal with that going forward. The other thing I want to point out is that, back in 1960, wine was about 7% share of all beverage alcohol servings. It tapped out a couple of years ago to almost 20 or 18%, but it's kind of flattened out. And again, this is where I'm saying growth is slowing down and probably will be more like the total beverage alcohol industry. And so slower growth and something to be thinking about for organizations in the wine business. Next slide, please. Another thing about wine is it is a highly fragmented category. And this was 2019 TDB label approvals. And it's been growing year on year, although it's slowed a bit this year. But the wine category had 125,000 new labels approved by TTB. And if you think about any other industry, any other category of consumer goods, I can't think of anything that is that fragmented. Obviously, spirits and beer didn't have as big a growth, but still, 15,000 new products in spirits, it's a lot of new products. Putting 125,000 new labels in context, about 35 million people drink 85% of the wine in the US. That's roughly 120 bottles per year per person. So of those new products, they have 1,000 new choices for every bottle they're going to drink. Again, it's fragmentation. And as we think about, what's going to happen post-COVID, this has implications of how to think about what we need to be doing as an industry. Next slide, please. These are some busy charts, but I tried to take a look at 2019 wine 9 milliliter per cases in general off-premise, wines that were shipped from wineries, wines that were carried out from tasting rooms in the on-premise, and then a 2020 look with projections for the last quarter as well. Basically, and everybody knows, we've seen significant increases in the off-premise, majority of the increases in major chains, which has been benefiting large brands more than small wineries. We've seen an increase in what's being shipped from wineries, but a significant decline in what's carried out from wineries and the on-premise. And this whole shift is disrupting who is doing what and where. Next slide, please. On a consumer spending basis, consumers spend more for a drink on-premise than off-premise. So, basically in December, rather than $8 billion of consumer spending last year, it's going to be closer to $7 billion. The fortunate thing is it's not going to be driven, that's not all going to drive back to winery and their selling prices. But as I've looked at the business, the bigger companies with big brands that sell a lot in retail stores, they're probably working through the pandemic fairly well because they have a lot of business increased business going through retail stores. Smaller wineries that rely on restaurants and their tasting rooms, they're seeing a big hit. And, it won't surprise me if we see some wineries that see a hit to revenues this year of 30 to 40%. For smaller wineries, as I say, that are focused on the retail rooms and restaurant business. Next slide, please. U.S. legal drinking age population. I said that, over 25 years, the legal drinking age population has been growing at 1.2%, and beverage alcohol servings have been growing at 1.2%. And if you look at the demographic trends in 20-year blocks, 20 years ending 2000, legal drinking age population was up 1.4%. Last 20 years, it's up 1.3%. And over the next 20 years, it's going to decline to 0.77%. So we're going to see a slowing of beverage alcohol, and something that people need to be taking into account And the way I look at this, total beverage alcohol will slow, and it's all going to become even a bigger issue of share and market share. And that's whether market share between beer, wine, and spirits, market share within those categories, market share within Napa, Sonoma, et cetera. But it's going to become more competitive. The other thing I should note is the grain of the population. You know, in this year, 14.1% of the population is 71 plus. By 2040, it's going to be 21%. And that's going to have other implications on consumption probably, which will slow consumption. It'll also have some implications on how we look at work, how we look at retirement benefits, et cetera. Next slide, please. Human resource implications. As I just noted, probably slower volume growth moving forward, and it's something we're all going to have to deal with in the industry and figure out how, as I said, how are we going to get the market share we need. Something that may sound a little bit counterintuitive is that when we get to March of 2021, we're going to see the off-premise chains show declines in their total sales. And the reason for that is when you look at March, April of this year, when restaurants closed down, a lot of that business just shifted to the off-premise chains. Ideally, with a vaccine, with restaurants being open at least 50% or whatever come April, some of that business will have shifted back. And as you look at sales goals for next year for your off-premise salespeople, it's going to be an interesting one to figure out how do you project those goals. On-premise, prior to the pandemic, it was about 16% of all wine sold in the US. I actually think over the medium term, and I'm talking 2, 3, 4 years, it'll only rebound to about 12%. And there's a number of issues with restaurants that have closed, restaurants having shorter wine lists, people's habits having changed, and they may not eat out as much or spend as much when they eat out. But, you know, as we recover from this and you look at on-premise salespeople, how do you keep them motivated when it's a smaller market? But how do you make sure you're allocating the right resources to each channel? As an industry, we've always looked at the on-premise being where you build brands. It's going to be harder to do that. But relationships will still matter, those relationships that people have with restaurateurs, on-premise trade people, and wholesalers. And it's going to be how do you manage those employees to work through that? The other interesting one, and looking at how long it takes people to change habits, and this really applies to salespeople, but it applies to other people in your organizations. You know, a lot of people's habits have changed and they may not be as willing to travel as much. And so how is an organization, HR professionals going to deal with people whose jobs are travel include a lot of travel, but their staff doesn't want to travel as much? Through COVID, interactions with wholesalers and the trade have changed. And going forward, we're not going to go back to the way we were, but how do we make those interactions as effective as possible and possibly more effective than prior to COVID? Next slide, please. E-commerce has become a more important component of winery interactions with the consumers. The trend's going to continue. Everything says it will continue. And I would just say that, you know, probably COVID accelerated how we were evolving to e-commerce in the industry, but it's going to become ever more important. Consumer visits, their habits may change. You know, how long does it take time to rebuild those consumer visits to wineries? And I think it's even going to be more important to make those visits truly memorable experiences to maintain those relationships. I mentioned about fragmentation, and one thing that fragmentation has been doing for a long time is it's made passing on costs increases a challenge, and so you've seen very little price increase. And that's where Leanne's slide about off-premise CPI was almost flat for a number of years. I think it will continue to be a challenge with a fragmented industry and slower growth. It's going to require a greater need for mechanization and automation in our operations, you know, whether it's vineyard, winery, it's back office, et cetera. That's going to mean there's a continued evolution of skills required. You know, people in vineyard operations not doing as much hand labor, but being able to manage more intricate equipment, and it just evolves from there. And then I think we all need to be looking at the implications of an aging population and whether that's the impact of the marketplace, the impact of people needing to stay in roles and jobs longer, or as we all know, the implications on health benefits and other things is health costs for the whole population goes up. Next slide, please. And I think that's the last slide. And Julie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. So Leanne, I have a question for you. Do we think that lockdowns are going to continue or come back up as full lockdowns? And then how will that affect the economy, sales, and layoffs?
I don't think we're going to get back to, or Leanne, do you want to go with this one, or?
Go ahead, John.
Oh, yeah. I think we're going to have a partial lockdowns, but I don't think we're going to go back to full lockdowns, even with an increased COVID case count. And the reason for that, I think that people have learned that just blanket lockdowns don't work. But I think it is going to be disruptive. I think one of the speakers earlier said something about, people drink when times are good, people drink when times are bad. I think volumetrically sales will continue. It's going to be interesting to see, though, just if it extends too long, how much damage will be done to the economy. Leanne, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, I think that echo some of that commentary about, the cost of doing business in these lockdowns. What concerns me right now is the increase in cases, and we have a transition of leadership in the middle of that. So I think navigating that for a new leadership may be difficult. And so I guess I'm a little more of it may stay locked down for a little while that is being sorted out. My employer has sheltered us through the end of the year. We've seen other employers shelter clear till next summer already. So I think you have to prepare for that, at least when you're budgeting, and keep that in your mind that it may linger a little bit.
Great. And John, this question is for you. Which industries will be competitors for staffing, CPG, marketing, construction, and how do we staff accordingly, do you think?
I guess I look at things, and I look right now at, just because of the dynamics between beer, wine, and spirits, I think we have a high risk of losing wine people to spirits positions. And that's the most directive. I think there's, wine people historically have had better relationships and they have developed better relationships with key trade people. I see other CPG positions looking at relationships being more important again. And then I actually think if we, on the production side, if we start to train people to be more effective at dealing with more complex equipment, we're going to be at risk of losing those type of employees to lots of different industries.
Okay. And Leanne, what kind of candidates do you feel are going to apply for industry jobs? Like in the tasting room, if they can't be educators, how will we be able to interact and build relationship with customers, given the parameters we have around the regulations in the tasting room currently?
It's a really interesting question. My son is 18 years old and he's a bar back for a local winery. So I get a lot of good intel from him on what's going on in the tasting room. And, I think there's still opportunities for education and may need to be more creative. You may need to ask that consumer, once they can come into your tasting room, would you prefer someone to lead you through this tasting in person, or would you prefer a tablet that's been sanitized that will lead you through the tasting once we pour, right? So maybe there are some interesting innovations that you can embrace, but the need for people to understand your product is always going to be there in some capacity. And I would think that you would continue to want to find people who understand it, or to train them yourselves if you need to. And John, I didn't know if you wanted to tag on to that.
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, perfect. And then Leanne, how do we go about living and budgeting? And when will we know when it's really bad? And how do we keep ourselves kind of in flow and going during that time?
Yeah, so John will talk about this as well, but from my perspective as an old banker for 30 years, the thing that's really difficult in a situation like this is remembering to go talk to the bank in the first place as you're making plans and you're budgeting. And my best advice there would be to get your most likely case together, but also do some stress testing on that, and maybe do a worst case and a best case scenario to take to your banker and to talk through the implications, because even a best case takes capital, right? And these are tough times for capital. So you'd want to be ready for that conversation. But John, what's your insight on that?
Well, I just think cash is king. And sometimes, you know, when you look at a P&L, you can be profitable with cash negative. And so you really have to be working with your management teams and understand what is going on right now and saying, you know, we didn't take in as many grapes this year. So we didn't spend all the cash buying grapes. We're not spending as much cash making wine. It's hurting that things have slowed down. But, you know, actually cash wise, we may be in better shape than we thought we would be. Another thing to think about the wine industry is that a fast growing wine business is a cash sink. If you have slower growth, you don't need as much cash. And so it's trying to understand the dynamics of the business model. And even though things may be slower, it may not be as bad as it looks.
Okay. John, how does what we're going through right now compare to 9/11 or the Great Recession?
I was running a business actually in upstate New York on 9/11, and it was dramatic and traumatic for a very brief period of time, but the business came back quickly. During the Great Recession, I unfortunately was dealing with Australia and UK and dealing with a whole lot of currency issues and other issues, and the business slowed. And if you actually go back and look at the data now, we didn't really see a loss of wine volume. We saw some transition from on-premise to off-premise, a little bit of trading down, but really the industry weathered it fairly well. This is much more traumatic for the industry, as I showed on just the depth of the recession. The duration of this and the amount that the market's been partially shut down or fully shut down is much more traumatic. And I think it's going to take a lot longer to come back from this than either 9/11 or the Great Recession.
Okay. And then the last question I kindly have about this is, if we touch on the election and the possible final outcome, how do you see a switch of hands to Biden having an impact on the economy and on jobs?
Leanne, you want to go first? Or you want me to?
Well, you know, I think no matter who's in leadership, and it is clear that we're going to have Biden taking over, you know, they are inheriting a host of problems that are going to take some time to get through. I think would be hard to imagine on day one all the solutions are going to come. I think we've got a vaccine that's coming out. I'm seeing more and more about that. A little difficult to deliver, but that could be a game changer, right? If we can get it delivered and get it to people. So I think that, you know, you kind of have to just look at the fundamentals. It's like turning the Queen Mary at this point. It's not going to be quick, in my opinion. And I think that matches what John was just saying as well.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would add is that for better or worse, we aren't going to really know how to predict how the next administration is going to be able to deal with things until the Georgia runoffs, and there's 2 of them. If we end up with a Republican Senate, we'll probably have more gridlock in Washington. And I hate to say it, but that's probably better for business than having a one party or the other running presidency, House, and Senate, because I think it'll swing too far right or left with either party. We will probably see less tax increases, other things that will be beneficial to business. But again, we won't know that till end of January. I am hopeful that the vaccine actually works. It gets released. We start to see a fair number of people be vaccinated that are the most at risk of COVID. And if we see that by the first quarter of the year, you know, we can start to see pressure off of lockdowns, et cetera, just because the part of the population that's most susceptible to COVID, that risk may be minimized and we can move forward faster.
Okay. And Erin, I think we're ready to take any questions that may have come through in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Julie, John, and Leanne. I want to remind attendees that you can throw your questions into the Q&A function, and if we don't get to them in time, we will definitely send them to our experts and have them respond via email. Julie, I want to put you on the spot real quick, and I want to ask, you're the HR manager on this panel. Listening to a session like this and how business is changing, how wine sales are going, what are some of the implications that you would take away from this panel?
I think to continue the path that we've been going on, where we're trying to be creative in the way that we sell wine, knowing that lockdown is around the corner at any time, and we just won't know. Putting all those precautions in place, but finding other ways to keep our staff engaged with customers. And then continuing to run a little bit lean, only because we don't know what lies ahead, and laying off people and restaffing is not something that we as a company take lightly. So just really looking for alternatives. Our team has become really good at that, and we've been able to remain above water for sure through this whole thing.
Excellent. All right. Well, I just want to thank you, Julie, Leanne, and John, again, for providing some context for the future of the business and the industry that we all work in. I know you're all very busy, and despite the fact that we're working from home, I feel like we're busier than ever. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all.